I'm picking up where I left off on the last video about the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. I'm writing a book about the revolution and my grandfather's escape from Hungary in November of 1956. So I left off with the revolutionaries, the freedom fighters, which is what they would become. They were protesters one moment and then guerrilla warfare freedom fighters the next, because the AVH, the secret police, began firing at them. So if you hadn't watched the last video, go back and do that so you know what we're talking about. The Hungarian Revolution began on October 23rd because a group of students started a protest in the streets of Budapest, and then it grew and grew. Hundreds of thousands of people, estimates go up to 200,000 people, that it just happened literally overnight, like within a couple of hours. Everyone gathered in the streets to protest because they were against the communist regime, against the old Stalinist communists, and they were outside of the radio building. The students were promised a microphone and the chance to go on the air, and then the radio people tricked them. So they were outside the radio building and demanding to be let in. The secret police, AVH, the Hungarians still called it the AVO, because it was easier to say than AVH, because they had a name change like in the early 50s from AVO to AVH. It's like the abbreviation for it. But anyways, the AVH, secret police, offshoot of the KGB, fired at the students. They fired warning shots, right? And they threw tear gas at the students. And so they got violent, as protesters might do. When you are shot at, you get violent. So they started throwing bricks through the windows of the radio building to try to get in. They broke down the heavy wooden doors that the secret police figured, oh, they can't get through the wooden doors. They did, which was a feat in its own. But anyways, it got violent, and there is a book called The Bridge at Andau. I cannot verify a lot of what the author put in there because there are no sources given, but it's like first-person testimonial type things. And somebody testified, like in an interview with the author, that they saw a mother holding a baby, and at the radio building, the baby was the first one to die. Like, the secret police shot, and it just so happened to go through the baby, but not the mother. She fell down, held up her dead baby, and said, "You killed my baby, you might as well kill me too." And that was the first, reportedly, allegedly, person who died at the radio building that day. Several people died, though. It got really, really violent. And back at the Kremlin in Russia, Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Communist Party, the leader of Russia, basically, he was an anti-Stalinist. Okay, Stalin died in 1953, and he was, and people did not like him, especially Khrushchev. So, Khrushchev was aware of what was happening, and so they were discussing what to do about the protesters, and then they heard more reports about how the violence had broken out, and then they said, we're going to enact martial law. It's the only way to like stop the violence, right? So they enacted martial law. They put in a curfew, and people couldn't be out past the curfew time, all that jazz. And they knew that it was going to take more force to squash this revolution than it did to squash the Polish uprisings earlier in November, because those weren't as violent, and the Hungarians were adamant at getting rid of the communists. I shouldn't say getting rid of them, because most Hungarians still liked some aspect of communism. They just wanted a more moderate kind of what communism should be, right? If you don't know, I don't believe any country that has practiced communism has actually achieved what communism should be, right? It all turns into a dictatorship, because when everybody is equal, which is like, you know, the on the outside of the book where there's like all of the highlights, like this is the best part about communism, right? The 5-star review for it. Everyone's equal. But that leaves room for the people at the top to take all of your resources, to make the most money, to not have to pay the same kind of taxes, or, just to create a complete dictatorship and then starve millions of people like the Soviet Union did. The Holodomor just starved out millions of people. China did the same thing. North Korea does the same thing. Communism has not been achieved. So the Hungarians wanted what it should have been. So a man named Anastas Mikoyan was like the liaison between the Soviet Union and Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution. So at the Kremlin, Mikoyan is like, why don't we put Nagy in charge, Imre Nagy, who the people wanted. He was in charge before, he was kicked out of the position, and they wanted him in charge again. So, like literally at midnight, the Kremlin was like, sure, put Nagy in charge, and he can fix it. And they wanted to send in Mikoyan to Hungary to make sure everything switched over from Rakosi to Imre Nagy smoothly, I guess. And they sent Mikoyan and several other communists, and then several communists in disguise, incognito, in order to spy on the other ones to make sure that they were doing their job correctly, because none of the communists in the Soviet Union trusted each other. So back to the protest outside of the radio building. They first sent in some Hungarian troops in order to like crush the resistance, because there weren't a lot of Soviets there. There were some, just not like entire fucking, what is it called? Fleet? No, that's a bunch of ships. You know what I mean? A group of soldiers. I'm not in the military. Anyways, they sent in Colonel Laszlo Zalami and his company. They were the first to arrive, and when he realized the protesters were unarmed and there were several casualties, he gave the order to his men to do nothing unless the protesters actually tried to get into the radio building. And they did. But he did not fire on the protesters. He was later imprisoned for his actions, or the lack thereof, during the battle for the Budapest radio, which is what the first battle of the revolution was coined. Lieutenant Colonel Janos, Janos is a first name. It looks like I forgot to put his last name. I'm gonna have to find that. Anyways, he was the one who commanded a tank regiment from the Hungarian army. 14 tanks and 17 trucks, and all of his troops were brought in to the scene, and he got there and then declared that his troops would not fire on the protesters, just like Colonel Laszlo Zalami did. Several soldiers even joined the protesters immediately, and they fought against the AVH, which helped the resistance immensely. Hi. The only thing in this house that likes me. Several soldiers tore off the sickle and hammer, like the Soviet symbol, from their uniform, and they said, I am not going to fire against my people who are fighting against the Soviets. So the people in the Hungarian army, they should have been loyal to the regime, because Hungary was a puppet state of the Soviet Union, so they should have been loyal to the Soviets, right? But they were loyal to their own people. Jesus Christ. How? I don't want to re-record this, dude. Okay, they were loyal to their people because they were Hungarians first and soldiers second. And most of the army had been conscripted, basically. They were young teenagers and young 20-somethings, and they were conscripted to the army. They were forced to do a service, and so they weren't like exactly enthusiastic. It wasn't something that they like aimed to do, so they joined the resistance. So the demonstrators were unarmed, but when the Soviets and, well, the AVH, which were Soviet puppets, began firing on the protesters, they went, gathered weapons, and came back for the fight and became guerrilla warfighters overnight. And the Hungarian soldiers who abandoned their duty to become freedom fighters, if they weren't arrested after the revolution ended, they escaped, and they were basically defectors. There was an entire there were a lot of refugee camps in Austria, but there was one refugee camp, and it was dedicated just to Hungarian soldiers who had defected. There were like 700 to 900 of them, and Eleanor Roosevelt went to that camp and then like took pictures and everything. Let me find the name. When I find the name, I'll put it in a little text blurb. Anyways, the Hungarian military had access to munitions warehouses and the barracks. So they opened up those munitions warehouses and started handing out weapons to the freedom fighters. Thousands of rifles just in the hands of everyday citizens, including literal children. And they had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. So they did. There were two military academies in Budapest. One was the Petofi and the other was the Zrínyi. They supplied the weapons. And then on Cespal Island in the Danube River, there was a building called the United Lamp Factory, and it was a cover for an arms factory. They later went to that location on Cespal Island, and then the employees of the factory took over and then started handing out weapons. So just before dawn on October 24th, the next day, the radio building was won by the revolutionaries after a battle all night, and the building was on fire. During the night, the Soviets sent in 6,000 troops and 700 tanks and stationed them all over the city. They blockaded streets and bridges that accessed Budapest, and then they stationed their troops and tanks outside of government buildings like the Parliament, which is massive. The Parliament building is one of the prettiest government buildings I've ever seen. And it's just literally the largest building in Hungary, I think, to date. The freedom fighters used barricades to keep the tanks out of certain streets, and the tanks weren't able to navigate through a lot of the streets because they were so small and the tanks were so big and they couldn't make super tight corners. But the freedom fighters used things like barrels and pieces of walls and cars and random things to create barricades. And they threw Molotov cocktails at the Soviets and they fired at them. And for a few days, the Hungarians looked like they were in the lead and people were celebrating that. Let's back up to Molotov cocktail. So Molotov was a Soviet. He was a person, and a Molotov cocktail is like a glass bottle. So they would take a bottle, fill it with petrol, gasoline, fuel, whatever you want to call it, put a string through and then cut a hole in the top of the cap, and then they would light it on fire and throw it, and it would explode underneath a tank, and it greatly fucked up a lot of tanks. They were able to get very many tanks disarmed and a lot of people with Molotov cocktails. And the majority of the people who threw the Molotov cocktails were children because they couldn't do much else. They can't hold a rifle very well. They can't do a lot of stuff, but they're small enough to run out and throw a Molotov cocktail. Throughout the course of the day on the 24th, the Soviets sent in 20,000 more troops and 1,100 more tanks and 185 heavy guns and 159 planes. All of that was fighting against kids on the street with rifles. And by kids, I literally mean kids. There were children who should have been in school, but school was canceled anyways because it was a revolution. Everything shut down. But there were 12, 13, 14-year-olds, 18, 19, 20. The average age of the freedom fighters was less than 25. They were kids. But even with all of that military force, the Soviets were completely unprepared for the guerrilla warfare that they were about to face, with very disorderly groups of rebels or insurgents, as they called them, but freedom fighters who gathered in groups. They would communicate with each other sometimes, but there were several different groups of rebels, and they were able to navigate the city better. They had that advantage over the foreign troops, and they knew that the tanks couldn't go down several streets, so that's why they made their bases. And they were able to barricade themselves and hide, and everyone in the city was helping in some way. I mean, not everyone, but a lot of people. They were supplying food to the revolutionaries. They were taking messages back and forth. They were making sure that fuel got to them for the Molotov cocktails. They were making sure that everyone was able to perform in this war that they were facing. And it was like, teenagers who knew a little bit about nursing would go and heal the wounded, not heal, but, wrap up wounded bodies and make sure that they didn't die from their wounds. The Soviets even initially ordered their troops not to engage in face-to-face battle with the insurgents, revolutionaries, freedom fighters, because they would risk casualties on their side. It was a highly disorganized revolution, very little plans, if any, and they were hastily drawn up, and for the first few days, the only battle strategy was fearlessness. Many of the revolutionaries knew that the battles that they were engaging in was not in order to win or to cause harm to the opponent, although that did play a part and they did enjoy causing harm to the opponent. It was just to keep the flame of resistance burning. And the longer they could hold out, the more it felt like they were doing something to change the country. I don't know if you've taken a look around America or the rest of the world right now, but things are going downhill pretty fast. And a lot of us feel like it's a resistance, or it's going to become a resistance, and we can't do much except for keep the flame of resistance going, because in the end, you can't win against an army of, hundreds of thousands of people, or the government that controls everything we do and say. Hi to the FBI man that watches everything I do. That part's a joke, but not really. At 4:30 in the morning on October 24th, the Budapest radio played this message. Fascist and reactionary elements have launched an armed attack against our public buildings and against the forces of law and order. In the interests of re-establishing law and order, all assemblies, meetings, and demonstrations are forbidden. Police units have been instructed to deal severely with troublemakers and to apply the law in all its force. This message was repeated every half an hour for days. Later, they put a little addendum on that message saying the Soviet soldiers are risking their lives to protect the peaceful citizens of Budapest and the tranquility of the nation. There were many bases where the freedom fighters convened, but there were 4 major bastions or strongholds: Sesma Square, Barrow Street, Tompa Street, and the Corvin Cinema, which had the adjoining Corvin Passage. So the cinema was an impeccable location for the freedom fighters to use as their stronghold. The entrance was blockaded easily. Tanks could not get close enough on the streets or through the narrow passage on the side of the building, the Corvin Passage. Through the cinema, the Hungarians had access to secret passageways and tunnels that connected to other streets in the area. It gave them a major advantage over the Soviets, who couldn't drive their tanks close enough or through the narrow alleys. The freedom fighters were able to pop out of the corridors and make a quick attack, throw a Molotov cocktail, shoot them, and then disappear really quickly. And the Russians could not see them coming, and the advantage that the Hungarians had boosted their morale significantly. Not only that, but they had a fuel pump behind the cinema so that they had access to unlimited fuel. And on the other side of the street, the Killian Barracks, an old military barracks that was being used as a stronghold. It was a fortress in the middle of a city. The cinema, the passageway that the Soviets couldn't get through, the underground tunnels, and the Killian Barracks. At the time, the barracks housed about 900 military conscripts. They were young Hungarians who had been enlisted in the military for compulsory service, but their hearts were with the resistance. The conscripts opened up the doors to the barracks that allowed the freedom fighters in, and that scared the Soviets because the freedom fighters now had access and friends within the Hungarian military. The colonel that was sent in to take control of the barracks also joined the revolution. Colonel Paul Malater, who has such a strange face, and I just made a TikTok about it the other day. His face is so angular, and he looks like Michael Shannon from, what was he in, Pearl Harbor? No, I don't know. Michael Shannon. I'll put some pictures. And a cross between the Grinch and the Monster of Frankenstein and, what's that guy? Bill Hader. This guy looks like a time traveler. He looks like so many people. And I think it's literally just the outline of his hair shape. Any white guy who has that shape of hairline can just look the same, but I digress. Paul Malater was sent in to take control of the barracks, and he was only 39. He was admired by the men that he commanded, and he was a registered communist, even though his political opinion had never been public. They just had to be a registered communist in order to be an officer or important in the country. And he had a conscience. So when he arrived at the barracks with 5 tanks, he saw dead teenagers on the ground, and disabled Soviet tanks blocked his way. He heard gunfire left and right. He realized that the freedom fighters weren't the fascist, reactionary revolution people that sorry, my kid is screaming. It's really distracting. He realized that they weren't fascists. It was mostly just teenagers and students. And they lay wounded and dead on the streets. He ordered his men to use doors from the buildings around as improvised stretchers to take the wounded inside and care for them. And then he told the Minister of Defense that he was joining the insurgents, the freedom fighters. And many criticized his decision for this. But he said, "This was the moment I knew I would have to make a decision that would change my life. Once in the barracks, it was clear to me that those fighting for their freedom were not bandits, but loyal sons of Hungary." The freedom fighters went on the offense. Some protesters immediately joined the fight, and some of the revolutionaries would join a group for a battle or two and then go home or come and go. A few thousand fought for the duration of the revolution. Some estimates go up to 26,000, but I think like the official estimates, but anything that comes out of the Soviet Union or any of their satellite states, official doesn't mean much because most of it is a lie or cover up. Anyways, official documents say it was a couple thousand revolutionaries, but some people say it was like 26,000. Like tens of thousands of them. So for context, Budapest had about 1/5 of the entire population of Hungary living in or in the townships, like directly outside of Budapest. The population of Hungary was less than 10 million people at the time, and about 2 million lived in Budapest. The revolution didn't stop at that city limits though. People all over, and in other large cities like Pécs, which is where my grandfather was from, they started striking and they started protesting and they started fighting the Soviets that were stationed in their towns, like in little ways. It wasn't as big. It wasn't huge guerrilla warfare like it was in Budapest, but the whole country came together. They all began protesting and they formed a general strike in solidarity with the resistance. And in industrial areas, the workers who were supposed to be the foundation of the communist society were determined to support the revolution. Transportation, gas, electric, all continued working. All of those employees continued doing their job because without those, the revolution couldn't continue. The Soviets were quite mad about that, as one might expect, because they're supposed to be like, well, you should go on strike and, help us stop the revolution because you're a peasant worker for the communists. You're the peasant class, which is literally what it was called. Like, they were the peasant class. And in an area called Red Cespol, Red Soviet Communist, to the south of Budapest, the industrial employees took over the factories. Like, they kicked out the factory owners. They were like, you don't belong here anymore because you're just a puppet. And a man named Rudolf Foldvari, I probably am saying that wrong because Hungarian is hard, but I've never looked up how to pronounce his name. He was a communist, but he joined the revolution and he turned his back on the Soviets. The farmers even arranged food deliveries to the freedom fighters, and they managed the collective farms on their own without the farm managers whom the Soviets had appointed. So the collective farming, this whole thing that the Soviets and communism really loves, is telling. And when they came into Hungary, they went to all of the farmers and they were like, well, you have to do what we say now, or we will put you in jail. And it became illegal to not join the collective farm, and then it became illegal to kill off your farm, basically, to just stop producing or to kill off your animals. And some people killed off their animals rather than joining the collective farming because the collective was controlled by the state and the farmers had no say, and they basically produced everything, got a pittance in return, and then everything that Hungary produced, 90% of it was sent back to the Soviet Union. So all of their crops, which the land was super fertile. Like, my grandfather talked about this all the time, how fertile and good the land was for producing, produce, vegetables, fucking whatever it is. And the Soviets took advantage of that. And then the state farms were a whole issue, and it was one of the main things of the revolution that they were like, we want this to stop and we want more control over our farms. Anywho's, I got off track. The farmers passed along messages to each other and then to the freedom fighters, and if they would deliver food to one group of freedom fighters and they would have a message to pass to another group, they would do that. So that's how they were able to keep in contact, because the Soviets also cut the phone lines, and for a while nobody could contact each other within Budapest, but they cut the phone lines, or not cut them physically, but they weren't allowed to call in or out of Budapest. So like if you were in Pécs, where my grandfather was, you couldn't call into Budapest, and vice versa. But another super off track thing, see, if any of my kids are watching, if any of my students, I hope you are enjoying this, because this is exactly how class was. I would get off topic all the time. Anyways, there was a lot of people who said, and there's no like documented proof of it because it's literally just word of mouth, that during the revolution, everyone was making phone calls, except for, in and out of Budapest. But they were calling each other left and right. Someone was like, yeah, like my parents made 300 phone calls a day just because they could, without the secret police listening. Because otherwise, the secret police would be listening to all their phone calls. So while the secret police was, being killed off and busy, they were calling everyone left and right, just, talking about the news, gossiping, did you hear about this? Did you hear about that? How's your granddaughter? All of this stuff, because the police weren't listening. And I think that's an amusing little tidbit that you will not find in the history books. If you are still listening, thank you. Remember to like and subscribe. I have a few more super long videos that are just like basics about the revolution, because there is so much to it, but I'm not even going over everything. I'm not going over every single moment, every single important person, everything. But it's a lot. It's a lot. And most of this has not been made super public because the Soviets hid a lot. I can't tell you how many sources. This is the book that I've been living off of. 12 Days by Victor Sebastian. There are hundreds of citations, hundreds of sources in this book that I've been able to go to. And I'm relying on all of the research that he put together and going and finding all of this shit that I have never heard of before this book. This is a phenomenal book. If you are enjoying this, 12 Days by Victor Sebastian, get it. It's actually really easy to read and written really well as well. This is already super long, so I'm going to leave off with this. Between October 24th and 25th, 14,000 more Russian troops arrived in Budapest to occupy the city, and 250 more tanks. They were fighting a small army of several thousand students, high school students, elementary students, university students, and peasant working class people, and about 1,000 Hungarian military who defected, essentially, and gone to the revolution. And on October 25th, there was a massacre of 800 to 1,000 people called Bloody Thursday. And for 30 years, the Hungarian government didn't talk about it. There was only one document for 30 years that mentioned this, even though they walked past the bullet-ridden walls of the buildings because they didn't replace them for years. And they said, didn't happen. Don't know what you're talking about. And I'm pretty sure there's still the official number of Hungarians who died sits at a couple dozen. They say a couple dozen people died. 800 to 1,000 people were killed. Unarmed protesters, and then they were buried in unmarked graves. And people didn't talk about it. So, yeah, that'll be next.